Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're just going to take a few minutes to let folks trickle in. Thank you for joining us. All right, I think we're going to get started because we are tight on time, but we're very excited about everybody who's with us today. My name is Adrienne Salazar. I'm with Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, and several of us are here calling live from Bonn, Germany at the UN Climate Conference. But before we begin, I'm actually going to pass it to our interpreters to share how to turn on interpretation.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. This is Flavia. I'm working alongside my colleague Heidi, doing the simultaneous live interpretation. So at this time, if you are connected through Zoom and you would like to listen to this gathering in Spanish, click on the globe at the bottom that says interpretation and then click Spanish and you'll be able to listen in Spanish. If you're connecting from a phone, this is located at the bottom right. There are 3 dots that say more. Click there and then click Spanish and then click done. If you run into any issues, let us know via the chat. And I will now say it in Spanish. Buenas tardes. Esta reunión tiene interpretación simultánea al español. Si ustedes quieren escuchar en español, en estos momentos, por favor, ubiquen el icono de interpretación. Está ubicado abajo, dice interpretación, opriman español. Si están conectándose desde un celular, esto está ubicado abajo a la derecha. Hagan clic en los 3 puntos que dice más, more, y luego opriman interpretación y español. Si tienen algún problema, déjennos saber por el chat. Gracias.
Thank you, Flavia. And thanks again to everybody joining us. I know folks are just trickling in. And for those of you who are calling in from the West Coast, good morning. I know it is early. It is the late afternoon here in Bonn, Germany. And again, my name is Adrienne Salazar. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the policy director at Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. And I'm very excited for this call. We are a small delegation of It Takes Roots members here for the UN Climate Change Conference in Bonn, Germany. And I'll say a little bit about what's going on, but I'll start by sharing a little about It Takes Roots. So It Takes Roots is an alliance of alliances, and we have been mobilizing under the banner of It Takes Roots since about 2014. And in particular, It Takes Roots has been coming to the UNFCCC, that's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Conference of the Parties, almost every year, bringing a delegation. And the organizations that now are part of the It Takes Roots COP delegations include Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, Indigenous Environmental Network, Just Transition Alliance, Climate Justice Alliance, the Movement for Black Lives, Black Hive, and some international allies like La Via Campesina and the World March of Women and Indigenous Climate Action from Canada. So it has been a space where we have been able to collectively move as Frontlines alliances, building solidarity with one another and in solidarity with our movement allies in the global south and across the world who come together at these convenings to advance our shared agenda of resisting false climate solutions, the control of fossil fuel industry on these international processes, and of global north governments advancing their agendas and trying to move forward an agenda of just transition and working together for interventions in this space where we're pressuring our governments and global north governments to do what is right and responsible for them to take up their historic responsibility for climate crisis. And so We're here in Bonn, Germany, in June, which is half a year away from the next COP. And I'll say a little bit about where we are in the process of the Conference of the Parties, and then I'll pass it on to our next speaker, who will share a little of the history of and the structure of the UNFCCC in this space. So many of you may be familiar that we come to the Conference of the Parties, the COPs. The last one was in Egypt, and the last one before that was in Glasgow, Scotland, and the UK was the host. And the Conference of the Parties is the space where countries negotiate their international agreements on addressing the global climate crisis. And so in between the COPs, the processes that are arranged and agreed upon at the COPs in the outcome documents, in the agreements that are made, imply work that needs to be carried forward by the countries and by the associated bodies of the UN that carry that work forward. So midway in the year at Bonn, where the UNFCCC is headquartered, they host the what is called the supervisory body meeting, the SB. So this year it's SB 58. It's the 58th meeting of this supervisory body, and this is the body that carries forward the work in between the COPs. And so what came out of the Sharm el-Sheikh document, what came out of the Glasgow document, that work continues through the year. And then this point is a point in which the countries advance a lot of the pieces of the negotiations that they've been working on, like just transition, the loss and damage fund, which was agreed upon last fall in the COP, and so on. And we'll hear a little bit more about some of the things that are being discussed here. But we are here because we are engaging in this process as grassroots and alliances of grassroots organizations to navigate how we can influence that process, how we can intervene to make sure our key demands are part of the continued work of the agreements made by the states, by the parties themselves. And our interventions that It Takes Roots Alliance aligned on in the fall at COP27 in Egypt, we're continuing to carry forward our advancing human rights and indigenous rights, 1, 2, climate reparations, including loss and damage, and 3, no false solutions. And so those are the 3 priorities that we've aligned on as It Takes Roots that we're continuing to carry forward in this process. And it's very relevant because each of these items is a central part of the negotiations that are ongoing today. So for now, I'm going to stop there and pass it to our next speaker, who will share a little bit about what the structure of the UNFCCC is like and what is the supervisory body, what are the meetings that are happening here. And that is Alberto Saldamando from Indigenous Environmental Network.
Okay. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alberto Saldamando, and I work with the Indigenous Environmental Network. There was widespread recognition back before 1992 that climate change was a real problem, that it was going to create a great deal of suffering. And so the Rio produced 3 conventions, including the Convention on Biological Diversity and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The objective of the convention, or the Climate Change Convention, and any related legal instruments is the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic or man-made interference with the climate system. And these levels low levels should be achieved within a time frame to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change, to ensure that food production is not threatened, and it would enable sustainable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. So they knew what was happening. They knew what the problem was about. So they adopted the Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Framework Convention now has 192 member states, and they meet annually. When we talk about states, we talk about countries or nations. They meet annually to review progress made in reducing greenhouse gases at their Conference of Parties, which are the COPs, the Conference of Parties. They also meet between sessions at a meeting of the subsidiary bodies, and that is bodies that advise them, including where we are now, the SUBSTA, or the subsidiary body for scientific and technical assistance, normally held in Bonn, Germany, where we are now. SUBSTA and the subsidiary body for implementation, or SBI, take the results of the Bonn intersessionals and write the policies from their negotiations, and then the SBI writes on how these policies are to be implemented. They are then given the products of their work to the COP, the Conference of Parties, that will be in later on this year, excuse me, for final political approval. And that is where the real political negotiations happen. The UNFCCC also allows NGOs like ourselves to participate in what is called constituencies. There are 6 constituencies in the UNFCCC, and they're listed in the convention: Indigenous peoples, women and gender, researchers, environmental organizations, municipalities, and business and industry. All but business and industry really are coming along to the same perspective that the problem is emissions, and what we need to reduce emissions and not take on these false solutions. But anyway, we'll get into that later. We as a constituency can accredit delegations to attend both SUBSTA and the Conference of Parties. So we'll be going to Dubai to try and see that our perspectives that we give here are carried on into those negotiations. The UNFCCC convention adopted principles and objectives and negotiated the Kyoto Protocol that gave a specific science-based program that should be legally binding on state parties. That is, the parties accepted that they were bound to reduce their emissions, with a view to accelerating the reduction of global greenhouse gases emissions and emphasizing the need for urgency in addressing climate change. But that didn't work out, because the parties, like the United States, ratified the convention, then they ratified the Kyoto Protocol, they laid out the scientific basis for reduction of emissions, and then they reneged. They didn't do it. In fact, emissions have gone up, I think, 19% since Kyoto. So what do? So they decided in Paris, in 2015, the COP in Paris adopted the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement also recognizes that deep reductions of global emissions will be required in order to achieve the ultimate objectives of the convention, and emphasize the need for urgency in addressing climate change. Also, in both conventions, really Kyoto and Paris, indigenous peoples are mentioned as our women and gender and intergenerational equity. But this is a voluntary manner. So the question really under the Paris Agreement is, what emissions reductions are you willing to reduce? And it's not legally binding, even if they willingly want to reduce emissions. Now it's how much are you willing to do? Both Kyoto and Paris agreements call for offsets and credits to be applied against emissions reductions in a market system. Kyoto had the clean development mechanism for global open markets on emissions trading, and so-called cooperative approaches that includes REDD+ and other kinds of it's a land grab of trees. Article 6 of the Paris market and non-market. Article 6 also includes market and non-market approaches. They changed the name of the market mechanism for Kyoto to the sustainable development mechanism. So now it's not the clean development, it's the sustainable development, but it's the same kind of shit. So excuse me. Article 6 also calls for non-market approaches, but even these can quickly be turned into saleable carbon credits. So the other panelists will be addressing these false solutions and the problems that we've been coming across and the policies that we're trying to affect. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto, for that grounding in where we are, the sort of complex structure of the UNFCCC, which if it's sounds complicated, it is. It's not designed for our folks to be able to easily navigate. And we're here. We're trying to influence where we can. And to talk about more some of the interventions that we're trying to make here at Bonn, I'm going to pass it next to Tamara, also from Indigenous Environmental Network.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Thanks to everybody who set this up, especially Adrian and the translators and all of the tech folks, Daisy, Mapache, and Craig. Really appreciate you all doing this. I'm going to talk a little bit about Article 6. And like others have mentioned today, there's all of these words and these letters, and it all becomes quite confusing. But just to put this out a little bit, Article 6 will follow on from in the Kyoto Protocol, which was the carbon trading mechanisms, especially around the clean development mechanisms, and also the emissions trading programs that were set up under the Kyoto Protocol. Under the Paris Agreement, it's slightly different. Some of it's the same-ish, but we're seeing a lot of very high-level technical discussions, and I'm going to go through a little bit of this right now, very briefly, but really happy to come back to this at another time more in depth. So I'm going to start in Article 6 on what's called Article 6.4, and that is the taking over from the Clean Development Mechanism, which was called the Sustainable Mechanism at first, but I'm not hearing that language here anymore. One of the controversial pieces, and there are many in Article 6.4, is that just before COP27, the CMA basically pushed back on the supervisory body to Article 6.4 and said, you all need to go back and redefine what carbon dioxide removals are, or they're also just called removals. And you need to go back and work on that. There are quite a lot of submissions against that. So carbon dioxide removals underneath 6.4 are basically two major streams. One are what are called biological removals, which are land-based, can be soils, forests, and also oceans. And the other stream of removals are engineered removals, like carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, bioenergy capture and store, carbon capture and storage. So these two major streams, which are not all offsets, but most of offsets, fall underneath that umbrella term of removals or carbon dioxide removals. There was also an open comment period or a call for submissions in March, which IEN and many other organizations that we work with submitted, and there was something close to like 20 submissions just in that one from a lot of the groups that we work with. That was more than they've seen, but altogether there's been over 100 submissions in the last few months. The supervisory body during the pre-meeting before the actual SB 58 that started on Monday, last week they had a pre-meeting to deal with this issue. And although they said several times to observers, we're so pleased that observers have, are engaged in this process, in the end, it didn't seem like they had read our submissions at all. In fact, there was very little reference until later in the meetings when the Secretariat had sort of, lumped it together. A very long story short, they are now calling for a new round of submissions, and that deadline is June 19th. But it's not just an open format. They've created a list of questions, like a questionnaire, asking for stakeholders to reply to. But that questionnaire is very biased. It assumes that CDR will happen. And the types of questions are more geared towards how do we make this work from a very technical perspective? And that's one of the main problems. A couple other issues is that we've been pushing for a grievance mechanism. And that means that, or like a for communities that are involved in these projects or other groups that want to leave the process or to complain about the process, we want that to be in there as well. And then any language on consultation, which we heard a bit about, has also very much been put on hold. And those are two areas that we're deeply concerned about. On Article 6.2, which is the carbon pricing program, big conversations around authorization. When do you authorize it? And what the 6.2 mechanism is it's basically how to track that countries, all of the parties, meet their nationally determined contributions or the contributions that they have agreed to reduce emissions or meet their sort of balance sheet. But within that, they can trade units, or what are called ITMOs, internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, and they can then trade those inside of the 6.2 platform that they're trying to decide on how to build. Some of the major issues here have been around what happens if a party or a country or a nation or state does not have a national registry. Can they then just put all of their greenhouse gas inventory onto the international registry that would be 6.2? Some other issues around what happens to ITMO units if it's transferred out to another country or party, and when does it get canceled? There's really big concerns about double counting or them just getting transferred through. Other issues are around the connection between the 6.2 and the 6.4 mechanism that I just described. They're calling that the mechanism registry of 6.4, or they're also referring it to the 6.4 ERs, or emissions reductions, and how that, when that gets transferred into 6.2, how then does that become an ITMO or be used for the NDCs? There are many questions around cancellation. There's questions around moving that out. And one of the things that was brought up that's deeply concerning is how REDD+ can be seen as a good example of transparency, or as a model for sectors. And that was stated by the Coalition for Rainforest Nations. And we're concerned about what they mean about transparency in REDD and using that as a model of transparency for 6.2. These databases have not been built out yet. They're still trying to decide on how to do that, and much of the discussion is around the flow of them, the transfer of funds. But what I do know from 6.2, which was discussed yesterday, is that these are assets, or these are financial assets that are being flowed through systems, and it's being discussed like a banking system, very much how an online banking platform would function, because these units, and whether they're an ITMO or an ER from the mechanism registry, they end up representing money and finance. 6.8, that is the 6.8 is the non-market-based mechanism, or non-market-based system. And a few things that we've learned here, just briefly, and then I will end and pass it on, is that website is nearly ready. The states will have a login, so much of the information will be behind a login system. What it looks like is it will be like a clearinghouse or like an auction house of projects, where states can basically put up their environmental services projects, and then look for financiers, whether they be from the private sector, and that it can include conservation NGOs, private sector finance banks, and you name it. They're not asking any questions. None of the relevant questions are being asked, and there have been rumors and speculation that 6.8 can then be linked in to the big 6.2 and 6.4 systems. So we have huge concerns about that. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tamara. Thanks for breaking down a lot of the threats that we're facing here. I know these are numbers like 6.2, 6.4, 6.8, technical terms. But what we're talking about is the exploitation and sale of our lands, our waters, our air. That is what is being negotiated here. The financialization of our ecosystems and the displacement of our peoples from them. And so that is why it's so important that we're here and that we also engage in the COPs ongoing. And to talk about another area that is being discussed that is actually very salient here, just transition. It's a key item on the agenda. I'm going to pass it to Jose Bravo from Just Transition Alliance.
Thank you, Adrian. So the conversation around just transition here in Bonn has been an interesting one. It's chock full of false solutions. Folks are talking about a just transition, including hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. And also the conversation has been, as of today, on the energy sector, about that there are different countries that are now pushing just transition models, like South Africa, who ultimately has far to go in regards to a just transition and is not necessarily a model that should be used. This is according to the other states that criticize the model happening in South Africa around a just transition on energy. Other things that we've been pushing back on is the fact that a just transition does not support a market structure. A just transition basically, again, does not support a market structure. So when we talk about pollution credits or carbon sinks or other things of that nature, we do not support that, and a just transition does not do that. The other pieces that are not being talked about that we brought up in certain meetings today were the fact that we're almost dealing with a just transition like nothing has happened in the past, and we're just moving towards the future, right? So we brought up the issue of the legacy of dirty energy and what that has left in many communities in the global north, or the south within the north, and then the global south, who literally have been paying for to get a lot of these multinational corporations all the riches and all their what they've acquired. The issue of workers. Folks here have conversations about workers, but it's literally just unionized workers. And I think we pushed the envelope and saying, you know what, there are other workers out there that aren't unionized, that aren't recognized, that need to be part of the equation of a just transition as well. And then moving us forward around the narrative of a just transition, right? Some of the discussion and the question to the parties that we proposed today, this afternoon, was the fact that what is happening with the different false solutions and what we tend to call false solutions, like the ones that I had mentioned before, and then how are they putting a structure in place to deal with what would be, again, another catastrophic economic piece in communities of color, indigenous communities, and poor working class communities. So it's important for us to have that discussion because, again, when we're talking about hydrogen, when we're talking about carbon capture, when we're talking about the different other things as forest management and whatever, they're not contemplating that it's not going to be in rich white neighborhoods. Not here, not in the global south, not in any place other than communities that are already overburdened and affected by the legacy of dirty energy. So a just transition discussion, has gone in many directions here. There's also a discussion around human rights in a just transition. But the fact that not having a discussion about the rights to Mother Earth in a human rights context as well is not being discussed here. So we need to land that back and make sure that the things that really, really are the issues that we are bringing to the table are listened to as well. So that's where I'll leave my presentation for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. Yes, so just transition is a term that came from our movement, and it has made it into the halls of the UNFCCC, and we have to be very careful that it doesn't get co-opted and it doesn't get turned into something that we don't mean. That's the risk here, and that's why it's so important that Jose and the Just Transition Alliance, who are an organization that is one of the originators of that term, working with communities and labor to develop the idea of just transition, are here trying to hold those countries and those corporations to account. So next, we're going to hear about some of the debate on a key item, loss and damage, which is related to our demand for climate reparations. And Pinel Ibe, who is coming to us from the Black Hive of the Movement for Black Lives, will talk about some of the things that she's been learning and engaging in here on that topic. Pinel.
Thanks, Adrian. Hi, everyone. I'm Pinel Ibe with the American Friends Service Committee, where I lead our policy work on economic and climate justice. And the American Friends Service Committee is guided by the Quaker belief in the divine light of each person. And we work with people of all faiths and backgrounds to challenge unjust systems and promote lasting peace. And I'm also a proud member of the Black Hive with the Movement for Black Lives. The Black Hive is at the center of the Movement for Black Lives climate and environmental justice effort. We're a collective of over 200 organizations and individuals representing the interests of Black communities within the US and across the global Black diaspora. And together we organize for cleaner, better, and safer futures for Black lives. So this is my first time here at Bonn, or the Intercessionals as they're called. And the reason why the Black Hive thought it was important to have a presence here is because a key goal of ours is to translate policy for our people. A lot of these spaces, like my colleagues have shared, are very inaccessible. The language is very inaccessible for our community members, and we are often negotiated as pawns and pieces in these rooms, and we're never consulted. Or in the moments when our voices are present in the rooms, we're not listened to. We're tokenized. And so it's important to, once again, keep our community members in the US and across the world where Black people live, exist, thrive, survive the climate crisis, to ensure that they're aware of what is going on and what is being discussed, and oftentimes what their governments are saying on behalf of them. Because there are majority Black countries, but you also have countries that have minority Black people. And the history of climate change is tied to colonialism and tied to slavery, which impacts and has impacted generations of Black individuals. So I'm just going to pop in the chat, if I can, our COP27 climate platform. And unfortunately, it is still very relevant because not much has changed. One of the few things that really came out of that advocacy when we showed up at COP27 as a delegation was to push for loss and damage. And in this entire document that you can browse through in your free time, the only thing that really we saw some movement or some significant momentum on was the loss and damage fund. So we're excited about that, but we're also cautious because a number of these ideas, these exciting opportunities to really address the climate crisis, died by 1,000 cuts of negotiations and working groups and transitional committees and papers and dialogues and roundtables. And they just reiterate and replicate spaces where we're talking in circles until nothing gets done while our communities are dying, aren't breathing, are figuring out how to migrate because they can no longer live where they call home. And so this is something that I'm really narrowing on while I'm here in Bonn to learn about the conversations. A quick background, yes, on loss and damage. So loss and damage, that terminology, once again, this is a space where terminology and semantics is very important. How you say things is super key. And what kind of words make it into documents is also important. Loss and damage was officially recognized after years of advocacy by small island states at COP19. And it was included in some mechanisms as well that was supposed to address economic and non-economic loss and damage on the ground. And then another network was created again called the Santiago Network that was to help catalyze technical expertise to address loss and damage. What the small island states and developing countries wanted was money, resources, because that's what we need. But they landed in technical expertise on how to address loss and damage. At COP26, we advanced, and the COP26 established a Glasgow dialogue to discuss the arrangements for the funding of activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage associated with adverse impact of climate change. And so this has kicked off a series of conversations hosted by something called the Transitional Committee, where they're coming together to figure out, what does this fund look like? So today in Bonn, the second Glasgow dialogue on loss and damage began. And there are many questions that they will be asking over a couple of days, but today's question was on the characteristic of the Loss and Damage Fund. For us at the Movement for Black Lives in solidarity with Black communities across the world and Indigenous communities and frontline communities, there are a couple of things that we always highlight when we talk about loss and damage. The funds have to be centered around and stewarded by the communities most in need, Black, Indigenous, and frontline communities. And they must be addressed within a framework of reparations beyond even what the United Nations defines. So that means that there's multiple layers of when we say the framework of reparations, and you can read up on that. But for us, that framing is super important in this space. Now, in the Glasgow dialogue, they're sort of playing a dance around the W's. So the conversation is centering on who gives the money, who gives the fund, and who receives the fund. What do they give and what do they receive? So if you're in the giving end, what are you giving? And if you're on the receiving end, what are you receiving? How do you give it and how do you receive it? When do you give it and when do you receive it? And so you can just get a sense of so many statements and stances are playing delicately along language, where some are saying the most vulnerable should get it, and some are saying those in need should get it. And to the layperson, it sounds the same. But when you really understand that the motivation behind certain parties calling on the most vulnerable versus most in need, then you realize that one is saying on a needs-based basis, if I identify as needs-based, I should access resources, while others say most vulnerable is sort of leaning into, let's collectively create an index. And if I am seen as someone who should be paying into it, ideally, I wouldn't want that many people to access the money because I don't want to pay too much. And so they want to narrow down who is the most vulnerable person or most vulnerable community or most vulnerable nation. And so there's that dance in every statement that you hear from different parties. And in this situation, parties are countries, right? And so something that is important to think about is, as they discuss the structure of the fund, we want to think about how it impacts communities in the US and also the US's role in paying as a big polluter, because a key principle is making sure the polluters pay. We need to make sure the funds that are coming in are new and that they're timely. There's a desire to rotate some humanitarian aid. There's a desire to move some funding from existing funding mechanisms into this. And we're saying no, new funding for communities now. We're also asking that that those in need get the funding. And that has a number of layers. Some people are saying only in need when a disaster is triggered. Others are saying before that, we should have a parameter. Some are saying project-based finance versus program-based finance. It all gets really meaty here. But for us, most importantly, is that Black communities are centered. Indigenous communities are centered. Human rights are observed. And that loss, which is already irretrievable things that communities are losing, culture, life, and damages that can be repaired are funded adequately. Thank you.
Thank you, Peniel. This is a really important, actually like historic debate that is happening, and that we've seen different versions of financial mechanisms that have resulted in vulnerable countries and communities not being able to access funds, actually funds that go through international mechanisms like the World Bank and the IMF, ending up harming communities. So it's very important that as the countries negotiate what this new fund is going to look like, that we say no to colonial financial mechanisms, that we actually have a real, just, and equitable fund. And finally, I want to pass it to Thomas Joseph from Indigenous Environmental Network, who will share a little bit about what are some of the actions that we have been participating in while we are here in Bonn.
Thank you. And so here in Bonn, we have been doing an inside and outside approach to actions. If people are familiar with what those inside actions were looking like in Sharm el-Sheikh, similar. You need to be able to get clearances from the UN, and then there was actions also outside, which is you need to apply through the local municipality here in Bonn. And so we've done both. The first solution, or the first action that we had, was an inside action, demand climate action that was the organizer of that, but ITR participated with a no fault solutions action. And it was a good way to let them know that we're here, that we're loud, that we're active, and that we see them. Not only are we following inside the meetings what is going on, they also see us when they're going meeting to meeting, and knowing that we're watching, and they know that we're here, and that we demand certain priorities to be met. The second action that we did was kick big polluters out. That was hosted by KBPO, and that was an outside action. And that was the day prior, that was yesterday. And so today, the president from the United Emirates, the president of COP28, showed up from the United Emirates. And so all actions were canceled at the beginning. But through negotiation, we were able to get a few actions approved for today. And so today, there was an end fossil fuel action by a collective of constituencies. During this action, there was 10 people up on the balcony, and there's a big banner, and the banner said "End fossil fuel." And so when the president came into the area, he's seen that banner. There's pictures of him walking by it, underneath of it, and then there was a group chant that was led as well. And then also today there was a no more fossil fuel reps at UN climate talks. And that was a fossil fuel political campaign, which is a European member of the Kick Big Polluters Out. And so we will continue to have actions here. We will continue to let them know that we see them and we're following what they're doing, and that we will continue to escalate our presence as well. And so thank you, and I will pass this back to you, Adrian.
Thank you, Thomas. And so we've heard from all of our folks who are here this week in Bonn, and I will just say that this conference is going to continue into next week. So some folks are going to be leaving, but there will be other folks. I know especially Indigenous Environmental Network, IEN, has a couple more people who are going to come here next week. So much solidarity to our comrades who are going to continue the fight next week. And we have some time now to take a few questions. So if anybody has questions, please feel free to just pop them in the chat, because it's a webinar. We aren't able to see you. So please just pop your question into the chat and I can read it off. We can wait a few seconds if anyone has any questions. And Peniel has also shared in the chat the reparations framework and what it means. What does reparations actually mean? Okay, so actually, Jose is going to jump in.
So today at the official meeting of the parties, there's a panel that included businesses or business representatives. And on that panel, representatives brought up the fact that there are plenty of resources being put out there in the United States, such as IRA, where businesses can now go to that IRA and see how they can get funded for model type of just transition projects like carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, and other things. And then it was also said that this money could also be used to retrain workers or shift those workers into other labor sectors like geologists who can now look for minerals needed in the future. So when we have that kind of a discourse here about a just transition, it is really, really nauseating because a just transition is not that. And that's part of the problem here, right? That it is very much associated to industry and looking out for industry's needs. So I just wanted to make that comment that came up in what was called a just transition in the energy sector.
Thanks, Jose, for bringing it home, actually, how some of the topics and items being negotiated here relate to our context in the United States, and or as folks know it, Turtle Island as well. So I see 2 questions in the chat, and we'll. I think if anybody else has questions, put them in now because we're about to close. The 2 questions are: is there a specific action or actions folks not in Bonn can do to support the asks you all are making? And the second is for those there for the first time or without prior experience at these events, how does it feel? And then I'll read all of the questions so folks can do maybe a final round of comments if anybody wants to answer them. Alejandria is asking, will It Takes Roots go to Dubai for the next COP, given all of the recent controversy? And Govinda is asking, how are the links between the war machine, fossil fuel use, environmental impacts, resource extraction, social displacement being addressed? So does anybody want to start? We can take maybe just a final round of comments and then we'll close. So if you want to answer any of those questions. Okay, Alberto is going to start.
Response to Govinda's question about war, and there was a press conference that Adrian really did a number in. It's very good about how war and global warming are related and together. I mean, the president of the COP, this oil sheik from Dubai, talked about how it was hypocrisy to blame the Arabs for oil when it was the West who colonialized them, to use them in proxy wars. And there you got wars today and all over the world, and it's a major problem. So yes, Govinda, we're trying to raise that issue. I think ITR particularly has been very vocal about that, and it's something that will continue to the COP. They can't ignore that. They can't ignore that pollution. And it's just it's leading to migration, it's leading to loss of subsistence, it's leading to food crises, water crises. For indigenous peoples, it's a loss of self-determination and land. So this really is a problem that we hope to address in the future, and I hope you can come and help us.
Thanks, Alberto. And I'll just answer first on the question around newer experiences and how it's been going. I think I would, as someone who attended COP27 last year in Egypt, I would say every COP is different because of the host, but COP27 was particularly interested and I would say much more chaotic as a first-time attendee. With this space, I've been able to track one particular thing. There are no pavilions where countries are displaying things. There are no sort of sideshow, trade show type energies here. And so you have the ability to focus on conversations roundtables and actually be listening to where negotiators are giving statements. That being said, a number of the spaces that I've been in where negotiators are giving statements, the statements have been very repetitive. And oftentimes you hear the facilitator even saying, please do not repeat what other people are saying because we don't have time. Say something new and fresh, keep it short. And it's very lengthy, and they're reading written statements. So there really isn't a dialogue per se. People have come in to say what they want to say, and they will not be reflecting on what the other country is saying. And so even if a country raised something around militarization or climate justice or indigenous people's rights, very rarely do you have other countries acknowledging that or accepting that into their stances and their statements. So it's been very interesting to see adults like just not listen to instructions where they're like, say something new and different. And I think the side events is where most of these conversations that we want to see happen, that's where they're happening. The goal oftentimes is to ensure negotiators make it to side events. That doesn't always happen. But I think activists and other civil society organizations here are being very deliberate to use this space to catch negotiators in meetings. And we've used this space similarly, both at COP and here to share the needs of our communities and to ask the US to not undermine efforts here, while also just to keep their act together, so to speak, to stop propagating fossil fuel exploration back home, but then playing the goal of being part of getting us to the 1.5 degrees Celsius, because it's very disingenuous and it's almost like gaslighting our communities.
Thanks for that, Peniel. And Jose and Tamara informed me that they're not going to have a response. So I want to ask if Thomas, Joseph, you want to offer any final thoughts on the questions that were raised.
Thank you, Adrian. So this is my first bond, and it has been quite the experience. I was picturing it more like the Indigenous Peoples Permanent Forum in New York, less people, more, able to move around from meeting to meeting. This is definitely a lot less intense than the COPs, but there's a lot going on here. There is a lot going on here. The meetings, collaboration with other networks. It's been a very busy spot. I do want to address the question pertaining to Alejandria in regards to, is ITR coming? Of course, that's above my pay scale for ITR. But I do encourage, as an Indigenous person that has seen the effects of like really bad forest carbon market offset projects and the continuation of the carbon brokers that plague my community, that come in every year, if not every other year. It is when your community is being served on the platter, on the table for dinner, it is vital that you are here, that you are able to speak to those issues. And so as ITR is a collaboration of alliance of alliances, I would suggest and hope that our alliances come and that we stand in solidarity with the people that are most directly affected, which is our communities, our people. And so the president spoke to the Indigenous Peoples Caucus today. He also spoke to the youth today as well, saying the same message, and so I feel that it is vital and it's very important that we continue to strengthen our alliances and stand in solidarity with each other. I know, again, it's above my pay scale and it costs a lot of money to do these things. I understand all of that, but I would just like to share that message. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas, Joseph. And I'll take the opportunity to wrap us up here and say that It Takes Roots is a collective of our organizations. So we are continuing to have conversations about COP28 in Dubai. Some of our organizations are committed to going to COP28. And when we're there, we will use the banner of It Takes Roots. So as long as there are folks, as long as there's 2 or more organizations from It Takes Roots that want to use that banner and going to COP, we will be doing that and we will be making these interventions. The conditions in Dubai are going to be different. They're going to be challenging, but we've learned some lessons from Egypt, and we're going to work with our allies to continue to navigate that space. I will also add that thank you for the question about war and militarization. Alberto raised the panel that I had the fortune to speak on. I'm just going to share it in the chat that you can watch this panel. It's been recorded, and there is a good conversation that is going. It's moving. And this conversation about militarization, it is at the margins because countries don't want to count military pollution as part of their commitments. It is not a part of any of the official agreements. So they can make all the commitments that they want, but pollution from the military, we don't even have the numbers. So we're pushing for militarization to be on the agenda, and not just to count the emissions, but to actually advance demilitarization through this international process. The last point I wanted to make is just that this has been, Steph had a question about what action folks can take. So what we do in this space and what we do when we go to COP, when we're on the inside, and Thomas Joseph outlined that there's an inside and an outside strategy. We're trying to put pressure on the folks who ostensibly represent us, right? When the U.S. government comes here, elected officials who have been appointed, elected officials appoint who are the folks that are going to be negotiating for the United States. Those people represent us, and in whatever ways you relate to the U.S. government, that's their job. And so we're here to pressure them and to lobby them, just like when we organize in our communities, we put pressure on our local elected officials, our state local officials, our members in Congress, the president. We're also trying to do that here. And we're trying to influence, especially the United States, which has been a big obstructionist force in the negotiations internationally for decades. And we are trying to work with our international allies in solidarity with them. And so you can make that effort as well by reaching out to any of our organizations, and we can follow up with you about plugging into some of our international work. Our organizations work together on campaigns in the UNFCCC space, as well as with other international alignments. And so that is the way that I would encourage you to try to also help us influence this process. I want to close by thanking everybody who joined our panel. The folks who are still on, thank you for staying on. Thanks for all of our panelists who are joining at the end of a very long day here at Bonn. Much solidarity to you all wherever you're calling from. And please share this information and the recording that we're going to have available to everybody afterwards. Thank you for joining us, and have a good day.